with the 7 billion people we have in this world, and I grew up in a 10,000 town, and now we live in a 20,000 person town, and in our county we have about 50,000 people. But in all this time, I still think only about myself most of the time. Most of the time that I spend, I think about my wants, my needs, my feelings, my desires, my dreams. And I just think that's not how we should be as Christians. I mean, have you thought about that lately? I mean, think about the last time you actually spent most of the day thinking of someone other than yourself or your family members. Can you remember the last time you actually thought of someone other than you or your family members? And you thought about their wants and their needs and all the things that are struggling with in their lives. I had a hard time thinking about that. And every time I come to read this book, the more it convicts my heart. And I just think, you know what, that is exactly the opposite attitude and perspective I should have as a Christian. That there's over 7 billion people in the world, but all the time I'm only thinking about little old Micah and Moses Lake. That's not the way it should be. And as I was thinking about this sermon, I was praying and I was writing and I was thinking, and even last night I was praying, and this morning I spent about 2 hours in prayer just asking God, help me to make sense of all this and help me to share it out to the congregation. Because you have a heart for people, and you show that time and time again throughout the Old and New Testament. Tonight we're going to be covering Jonah, and God's going to make known, you know what, there's 120,000 people there that I care about. We read Obadiah and saw how they did nothing for their brothers, Israel. We read, as we're going to be reading next week, and Sunday evening, we're going to be reading about Amos. And that is one of the most social justice books you read throughout all of Scripture. And the more and more I read about what God desires, the more I see He says, think about other people. Care about their wants. Care about their needs. The whole time I thought about Jesus and how He always had compassion. Have you thought about the time when John the Baptist was killed, his relative, and he went to go be by himself, but then the crowds followed him, and it said that he had compassion on them. And so he taught them, he healed them. Or when the teachers of the law came to him, and the teacher of the law asked Jesus and said, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus told him the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he asked, well, who is the neighbor? And that teacher replied, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. I think about a parable like that and I struggle with it because I think about how I'm sometimes that priest. Sometimes I'm like that Levite, and I'll see someone in want, I'll see someone in need, and I'll just walk past and as if nothing really matters. Because I don't want to be inconvenienced. I don't want to be bothered with. But if I'm to fulfill that commandment, that second greatest commandment, to love my neighbor as myself, I have to have that mercy. I mean, as Christians, we struggle with this because sometimes we get out, we form ourselves in that mold of the world that says, think about yourself. Think about yourself as a priority, when all the time God says, don't think about yourself. You are to deny yourself. You're to die to yourself. You're just supposed to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. And all the time in the ministry of Jesus, Jesus thought about other people and their wants and their needs. He cared about the lepers. He cared about the outcast. He cared about the woman at the well. He cared about people. Do we take the time to care about people? I mean, we live in such a busy world. We live in such a busy time where it's so easy to just live our lives and make excuses for why we don't take time to get to know people. Why we don't take time to build relationships. Why we don't take time to ask ourselves, are we going to pay attention to the hurting people around us? Because there are people who are hurting all around us. One of the things that really bothered me is over the last few weeks, as I was thinking about this lesson, I decided to go out into the community and start finding out about some of the hurting people in our community. I went and spent some time with Gavin Rose. And Gavin is Rick and Chris's son, and he is the homeless coordinator for Grant County. And so he gave me some of his time. We went out for coffee, and he gave me a few hours time, and I just said, explain to me the homeless situation in Moses Lake and Grant County. And the surprising thing was I was so amazed at what I learned. Because he says, you know what, oftentimes in the media and everything, and in the movies, we publicize homelessness as they're the drug addicts, they're the winos, and so forth. But in reality, he said, do you know what the biggest demographic of people I get in my office asking for homeless assistance is? He said the biggest demographic he gets are single mothers. Single mothers who come in and say, you know what, I have no support system. I have a deadbeat guy who left me with no support, and I don't even know how to get a hold of him. My parents don't love me, and they won't let me live with them. And the whole time I'm just thinking to myself, when Gavin was letting me know this, saying, you know what, that breaks my heart. Never have I ever been without a support system. I've always been, wherever I moved, I've always first, me and my wife Disney, we would go and we'd find a church and we'd have an automatic support system. People in the world don't have that. Does it break your heart that those people are hurting? This last few weeks I went and spoke with some social workers with DSHS to ask about the children. And they said, you know what, children are some of the worst kids being affected by the economic situation, because now that the economics have been getting worse, guess what? Who's getting homeless? Guess who's getting abandoned? Guess who's getting beaten? It's the children. Did you know that there's over 250,000 kids in foster care in the United States right now? And in Washington State, we're in the tens of thousands. We're even in the thousands in Grant County and Adams County combined, with only 92 foster parents in the whole county. Does that break your heart? I mean, God said He's the defender of the widow and the defender of the children and the orphan. Yet, are we taking time to think about these kids? I think about how some of these people are some of the most hurting people. I had a conversation with a lady, and it broke my heart, because this is a woman who had a horrible life, and she said, you know what really hurts me? Is that I don't have a support system. I don't have anyone who loves me. And I tried to go and do the religious thing, but guess what? They treated me just like the world did. Like I had no value, no worth. They didn't care about me. And she said, you know, I don't know anything about the Bible, but what I do think I know is that God cares about people, and that Christians are to represent God. And if God is this loving God, and that Christians are to be those who represent Him, then how come they're not the ones who are most active in showing people that they love them? That they would be the first ones to say, you know, I know a God who loves you, who values you, who treasures you, and you know, I am His representative on earth, so let me tell you about God's love, and let me show you God's love. Are we being those who are looking around for opportunities to care about the needs of other people? I mean, time and time again, we read about faith and we're saying faith has to be active. Dave did a really good job emphasizing the natural overflows of faith. Well, if the natural overflow of our faith is to imitate Jesus Christ, then the overflow of our hearts has to be compassion, mercy, caring for the weak in our society. I mean, are we doing that? Or another thing that I went over is about a secret problem that we don't like to talk about, but it's present, is that spousal abuse of women. We have a New Hope organization, and do you know what? They say spousal abuse is really big. Anyone here ever have a relative who's been beaten by someone? I do. Those women do not like to say anything. They're scared to say anything. Those who they expected to protect them are hurting them. What are we doing about that? We as Christians should be the most brokenhearted about all these social causes, because all the time God is saying, you know what, I care. And if I care, guess what my people should do? They should care as well. Or what about people who are hungry? Disney's grandparents, who are members of the Sweet Home congregation, as part of their faith, for years and years, they ran the food bank in Sweet Home, Oregon. That's what they did. They wanted to feed people, saying, you know what, as Christians, we're mandated to care and think about other people, so we're going to do it, and we're going to run the food bank. And so when I went and visited with them one time,